So real fast, I don't think all white hats or all of our tribe here in Vegas this week, even if you don't identify as a white hat, have the same motivations. So one thing that's been very useful to talking to policymakers, we should also, yeah. Bo and I recently left the private sector to go to a nonprofit policy think tank. So he literally went to Washington. So Mr. Geek goes to Washington. I'm just traveling often to Washington, but we're trying to more directly influence public policymakers. We were doing a lot on top of our day jobs, but we saw that we weren't getting better fast enough. So we want to be a platform and a conduit for any of your concerns. And we've built trust relationships with executive branch, with legislative branch, with justice, with, we've built some of those trust relationships. We're still building some more. But look at this as not that what we're doing, because we can't do it. But look at us as a platform and a conduit for your deepest concerns. But one of the things that's been very helpful is they don't know why hackers would hack anything. They're like, why would you do this to us? Why would anybody hack our vehicles? What are you, crazy? You're endangering everybody. You must be trying to extort us, things like that. So one thing that was very useful is I kind of broke it down into 5 motivations of white hats. And no one is just one thing, right? I have 2 of these. I major in one and I minor in another. And each of you may carry a different one. I find the B-sides crowd tends to be a little more similar than maybe the DEF CON crowd at writ large. But there's protectors that want to make the world a safer place. There's puzzlers who do it for challenge, for curiosity. It's probably what started the hacker culture was the curiosity. There's prestige that want to win the white jacket or be a rock star or be on stage in Keynote, DEF CON, or Black Hat. There's profit, which is to make a living or personal gain. And then there's protest. You're for or against something, but lawfully. Think like protecting dissidents or outing corruption or things like that. This becomes really important as we acclimate 100-year-old car manufacturers and very long-standing device manufacturers and medical to realize you don't have to, depending on how you engage and what your coordinated vulnerability disclosure looks like, you're going to attract or repel subsets of these. And how you interact with them will differ. So if you're working with someone who's primarily motivated for prestige, they're not going to negotiate with you to give you more time before their DEF CON talk. They're going to do their DEF CON talk because their primary motivation is to do the DEF CON talk. Whereas if it's a protector, they're not really out to get noticed. And some of the best car hackers we've met, for example, you've never even heard of them because they're just doing it to make the world a safer place, or they're doing it because it's fun and it's a hard problem. So for me, I'm a protector first. I want to make the world safer. And it doesn't hurt if it's a really, really hard problem. So I'm a puzzler second. I'm not sure what yours is, but I'd be really eager to find out. Typically, the people at B-sides are a little more consistent. Obviously, there's other motivations, but that's the simplest way to do it. And people in policy like short lists, and they like them to have the same letter at the beginning of each of them. So we went through some of the what's working and what's not, and I'm not going to go through in great detail what the 5 stars are, but let's just pick one. In the first year, on our first birthday, we published this one for the automakers, and it started a pretty robust multi-stakeholder collaboration process where people said they were doing security, but no one could actually describe what they were doing or which parts they were doing. So without reading all these, we basically said all systems fail, so you need 5 ready postures for failure. We're not going to prevent car hacking, we're just going to make it less damaging. So the first one is, do you tell your customers how you avoid failure? Second one is, do you put out a welcome mat to take help avoiding failure from researchers trying to help you? Do you have a way to capture, study, and learn from failure? Do you have a way to promptly respond to failure? And do you have a way to contain and isolate failure? It's a way oversimplified version of much more elegant language, but we're just assuming cars will be hacked. We want to make sure a hack of the stereo can't shut off the brakes. We want to make sure that you're taking help from researchers instead of sending them cease and desist letters, those kind of things. And even though this stuff won't make the cars much, much safer, it starts a culture within these organizations to prioritize cyber safety issues. The evidence capture is the one that's really freaking hard because of some competing ground truths. But what I'm going to walk through and what I promised I'd walk through is this one. And I'll do a short version, but my hunch is we're going to dive deeper into each of these later throughout the day. We haven't published this, but I've been using it for all 3 years of the cavalry stuff. When I go to like a big industrial controls manufacturer and they say, well, how is this different than IT security? We already have a security team. How's IoT different? The easiest thing to do, and I've done this in 1 hour, I've done this in a half day, I've done it in a full day, is to walk through 6 ways it's different. And this is where things start to get uncomfortable with our friends, because we have long-standing beliefs about when a device manufacturer doesn't fix something, the only way to catalyze a fix is to do a disclosure. And that's true for websites. But what happens when it's an unpatchable industrial controls device that can cause cyber-physical damage? So it can't be fixed. The act of us disclosing that, even though that's our conventional wisdom for 15 years, may actually be the thing that puts people in harm. Sometimes obscurity is all we have. And I feel very conflicted about that, because for a long time we've seen evidence that if you want someone to fix something and they won't fix it, you go public. But for some of these forever days, that could be really, really dangerous. And one of the ways I've helped people understand this in the cyber safety or cyber physical industries is with this framework. So really quickly, I say that we have different adversaries than we're used to dealing with. It's not going to be script kiddies or card scammers for some of these cyber physical systems. Different adversaries with different motivations and different capabilities. Number two, there'll be different consequences of failure, and I'd like to get into some of those. But really briefly, we won't measure these in the number of records lost or number of credit cards lost. That's how we currently measure breaches. We're going to measure them as in number of lives lost, in impact to GDP, or gross domestic product, or in crisis of confidence in key markets and national security. I mean,
What does that mean for geeks?
For what?
For geeks.
For geeks?
So break that down, because that works for policymakers.
Yeah, you're right. So we're in this tenuous role where we're translators and ambassadors. So sometimes we have to use words like cyber, and people are going to have to get used to that. Don't worry, we'll do plenty of drinking this week. What it means is the fact that something, and we were just talking about this, the fact that there's cross-site scripting in something doesn't mean it's a business impact. So we focus on what's broken, but maybe not why it matters to the business. But when you're talking about some of these things, if my mother-in-law no longer trusts her Jeep because there's enough hacks or someone gets killed in a Jeep, Jeep will probably go out of business. There'll probably be a hostile takeover. I mean, if you hit the stock price enough, if you damage brand enough. And when we were talking to some congressional folks, they said the automotive industry, when they decided to bail out Detroit, for example, the math was pretty simple. They saw that 1 in 9 Americans were employed directly or indirectly by the auto industry, because they're either an automaker, a tier 1 supplier, a service technician, a parts manufacturer, a dealer association. So any loss of a single OEM was calculable to be potentially double-digit impact to the U.S. economy. So maybe all they care about is money, but that gets their attention. Whereas, maybe a single person dying from an accident doesn't matter to them, because we have about 100 fatalities a day in the U.S. for car accidents. That's just kind of acceptable loss. I don't think it's acceptable, and NHTSA doesn't think it's acceptable. But it's not the fact that there'll be a death. It's the fact that an exotic death might scare someone so bad that it hurts the economy. It makes people not trust these safer modern vehicles. And more importantly, as we saw post 9/11, or we saw in what's happening in Paris and other parts of the world, is when you have a catastrophic failure from an exotic adversary, we tend to compromise our values. We tend to send blood and treasure overseas. We tend to introduce secret FISA courts and programs that were leaked by Snowden. And so we want to make sure that we preserve trust and confidence, because a breach or even having someone like a Target go out of business would be an acceptable loss for the country. But having a crisis of faith in the government's ability to protect you is not good, really not good. And if you're trying to provide cutting-edge medical treatment to improve life and sustain life and prolong life, and people and chief medical officers stop trusting some of these hyper-connected devices, that will negatively and adversely affect all the benefits we could have from modern technology. So the consequences of failure are not going to be breach records. It's going to be measured in different units and more consequential units. The context and environment changes. So these are not operating behind layered security perimeters. If it's a medical device that's attached to your body, it's a migratory device. There is no perimeter, and there never will be. The device is going to be its perimeter, in combination with some of these other things, you can't just assume you're going to have a UTM in your home that somehow shields you from all of the things that might attack the growing number of IoT devices in your home. People call a car a computer on wheels. It's more like a data center on wheels with several cloud components, right? So the operational context and environment we cannot assume is identical to normal traditional security. The composition is different. So the hardware, firmware, software stacks are going to be very different depending on which type of IoT we're talking about. And one of the reasons I do this with manufacturers is if you're a small device manufacturer on Indiegogo Kickstarter project versus a Siemens industrial controller that's going to live for 30 years and cost millions of dollars to buy, this framework becomes increasingly important to understand the physics and dynamics of how to do this stuff. So in the composition of goods, you're seeing a lot more ODMs bought by the pallet. You're seeing really cheap stuff where the margins matter. You're seeing a lot more Android OS, which is super secure, right? So we should put it in all sorts of embedded cyber physical systems. But it's because
the Xworks is great, right?
Yeah. So the kind of things that people gravitate to for either price reasons or developer talent force reasons are fairly different. They're not going to be Windows in all cases, right? They're not going to be familiar, which is both a blessing and a curse for adversaries. But different economics. So sometimes if it's a really small device manufacturer or like a Nest that used to be small, they don't have a CISO. They don't have a security staff. They might only have 3 employees. In fact, I heard from the FDA the average number of employees at a device manufacturer is 7. I don't know if that's accurate still, but I heard 7, I've heard 11. But what's the probability that one of those 7 or 11 is a cybersecurity expert threat modeler and secure coding expert? I mean, Bo and I, usually when we talk to a manufacturer, one of the first questions we used to ask, we don't even ask anymore, is which threat modeling method do you use? And after everyone said, what's a threat model? We stopped asking for a bit. We get them there, but we don't ask them on the first call anymore. Sadly, though, Brian Knopf, DUQA, he gave a flash talk at the IoT Village last DEF CON a year ago, and he asked the room which threat modeling they use, and none of the hackers knew what a threat modeling tool was either. So that's not good either. But we got to work on that, because if these things haven't been threat modeled at the design stage, they stand very little chance of being resilient to attack in operational environments. But the economics is incredibly important. Depending on what you're talking about, the margins may be negative. There might not be a budget. The price point, even if you spend 10% of your cost of goods on security, if your cost of goods is $20, it doesn't work out so well. So we've had some uncomfortable conversations about certain device types under a certain price point will never be secure and will never be securable. And therefore, maybe if they had the ability to affect public safety, they shouldn't exist. Maybe. And these are uncomfortable conversations. And then the time scales is really important too. So the time to live for my phone, right? How long do you keep a phone? Now, they can live longer, but how long do you keep a phone? 2 years, 3 years? How long do you keep, the average durable good of a car is 7 to 11 years. So if the body of the car is durable and useful for 7 to 11 years, but we're increasingly buying the car based on the technical features of a cell phone, there's a mismatch between really legacy outdated software and the physical durable goods. If it's a Siemens industrial controller, the ROI might be 30 years. Like, to buy that thing, it better work for 30 years. Can we anticipate all the new threat models 3 years out from now, let alone 30 years out from now? So there's really poor future proofing on these things. So on the scale here, what we basically do is we make a grid, depending on which things they're looking at, and we try to factor in what's the time scales, what's the margins, what's the regulatory, implicit in the economics is what's the regulatory pressure for your sector. And they look very, very different when you're talking about a Fitbit versus a nuclear centrifuge device. Anybody have questions or objections or major omissions on this little framework? Because this will help us when we talk about some of the uncomfortable truths. All right, let me make it concrete. Hospitals, we're going to get into a lot, but hospital medical environment, it's composed of lots of medical devices, and we have some medical device manufacturers in the room. Even if they wave a magic wand and make really, really good secure devices right now, that they come to the market a year from now, the economics of a health delivery organization is they don't have a lot of budget. So we talked to a bunch of, I'm on the Health and Human Services Cybersecurity Task Force that Congress asked for in December, and Michael McNeil from Philips, who was here yesterday, he's also on it. It's very overwhelming. We have some healthcare delivery organizations, small ones and large ones, on this task force, and their statistics show that most healthcare delivery organizations, even large ones, don't have a CISO, and many of them don't even have a single IT person on staff. So how do you do network segmentation and isolation, and system hardening, and patching, and basic hygiene when you don't even have a single IT person on staff. So the economics are such that one of them said, we can either hire a CISO or a surgeon. We can either buy a firewall or an ambulance. And they went up through medical school, so they're leaning towards, now some of that might not be true, it might not be zero sum, and if the regulatory environment changed, if the incentives changed, if the culture changed, they would realize that they shouldn't buy a house they can't afford and get upside down on their mortgage on the IT and security debt in some of their purchases. But at the moment, they're incredibly prone because in their culture, in their economics, and in their incentive structure, that money is fairly zero sum and it goes to more health delivery professionals. So in the adversary model, I don't think Russian criminals that do card scamming would take down patient care in hospitals. I don't think that's likely to happen. I think it's more likely to be some adversaries that are ideological, the kind of people that shoot up a nightclub, the kind of people that blew up the finish line of the Boston Marathon, the kind of people who like Trick, which I have a slide for him. But Trick was a member of Team Poison Anonymous, and he radicalized, and he moved from the UK to Raqqa. And shortly after DEF CON last year, he was killed in a drone strike because he started the cyber caliphate, was recruiting people to come hack for ISIS, was training them how to use Shodan to find our hard-coded default passwords in our hospital equipment and in our power plants, that nobody bothers to keep off the internet, that nobody bothers to change the passwords. Some of them, they can't change the password. So what you have is someone with the means, motive, and opportunity to negatively and adversely affect patient care. And we typically dismiss this stuff as FUD, but it happens to also be true. And it's very easy to make new versions of Junaid Hussain. So when we run through these kinds of things, who has the means, motive, and opportunity to hurt a hospital clinical environment? What are the consequences of failure? Well, you'll probably have loss of life. You'll certainly have shattered confidence. You might have chief medical officers less likely to attach more and more critical systems to the internet, which hurts things like meaningful use and all sorts of other electronic health record initiatives. We don't want that, because as we can start to share electronic health records more accurately and more interoperably, there's a belief that things like machine learning might actually cure diseases we haven't cured yet. The context and environment, they can't do segmentation and isolation because they're forced to be hyper-connected. The composition of goods is, unfortunately, in this particular case, way too familiar. It's a lot of Windows XP. In fact, even when you give them new devices, one of the comments they made was, you're going to have to pry our XP out of our cold, dead hands, because when they have a system that works, they have very good, necessary reasons to not mess with it. It's just we have not impressed upon them that using something like, in fact, I had a really good analogy the other day. It's expensive for surgeons to wash their hands really rigorously and methodically before surgery. And it takes a lot of time to do that when they could be doing surgery. And they do it because after analysis of post-op fatalities and post-op infections, things like the Checklist Manifesto justified that's necessary hygiene to come out to the outcomes and the survival rates we want to see. But we haven't figured out that a failure to cleanse your XP from your operating environment and your clinical delivery environment may be the equivalent of failing to wash your hands before surgery.
Just don't say cyber pathogens.
I will not say cyber pathogens. Right? But the economics are really important here, and the time scales are also really important, because if you go to make it a purchase of a really expensive piece of big iron, something like MRI machine, the capital justification is that thing has to be functional for a minimum of this many years to be cost justified. So the timescales are much more protracted, and even if you could demonstrate a clear, unpatchable, unmitigated pathway to harm in a clinical environment, the hospital will still have to use that device for a long period of time, knowing full well that it may be vulnerable, because the business is there to provide health care. And they'll have to come up with some creative way to do some sort of mitigation or segmentation if they can.
When you're talking about adversaries and consequences, you spend a lot of time talking about the hostile actor, but I think that you've glossed over the economic hacker in Russia, because the same hacker that's willing to ransom corporate IT environment back to someone for $50,000, why wouldn't they ransom someone's MRI machine back to them?
Yeah, I am going to touch on that. I might as well do some right now then.
Economic arguments seem to drive a lot more change faster than
yeah. Let me pull up one little slide. This is Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital in Southern California. Most of you heard that ransomware is hitting hospitals. Ransomware wasn't trying to hit hospitals. It just landed in certain hospitals initially. So the SAM attack was leveraging a known vulnerability in JBoss and lots of medical devices that happened to be exposed to it. And people didn't know they were vulnerable, so they didn't know to patch it. This is a great argument for why we need software supply chain transparency and software bill of materials and all these things, so we can actually tell what we're using, where we're affected, so that if we hear that somebody has a hospital ransomware infection, you should be able to ask, are we affected? And where are we affected? And which systems we need to isolate or patch? And you can't really do that at all right now, except for a few exceptions, like Philips is voluntarily publishing a software bill of materials lately. But this particular hospital didn't pay the ransom. They happened to accidentally get hit by it. The ransom was very low. I think if they knew they were in a hospital, they could have charged a lot more. But the effect was the lack of flow of electronic records essentially prevented them from delivering patient care for a sustained amount of time. And they diverted ambulances. They tried to move certain patients at one point. And depending on the severity of the victim in the ambulance or the severity of the patient you need to move, that's a really high-risk maneuver. And it takes a lot of staff to do it safely, while they should be focusing on the delivery of patient care that people need and deserve. So when I saw this spring, this is one of the reasons Bo and I left the private sector, because I said, this is not good. If an accident can cause a denial of patient care, if random network bouncing traffic, just normal cesspool of the internet can cause this, what could someone who wanted to do it do? And more importantly, what's our response time? Like, could we even shut it off if we wanted to? Sure, you could try to patch that one device. But I don't know if you guys heard, this came up on a panel last night at Codenomicon. Billy Rios took a look at one device that had over 1,400 known CVEs in the one device. And someone said, oh, that's exotic, it's an old one. And we looked, I'm like, yeah, it's a little old. Let's look at a new one. About 1,000 known vulnerabilities in a typical clinical device. Now, the smaller ones have less codes, they have less vulnerabilities. But there's lots of old JREs, there's lots of old operating systems, there's lots of things like Bash, there's lots of just poor supply chain hygiene, people using older versions of OpenSSL or HTTP client. One of the big irons he looked at is still using DOS. So the kind of hygiene you see in a typical environment, if there's 1,000 of those vulnerabilities in the average device, and one of them was able to shut down patient care, it shows that we're in an incredibly fragile state. So to your point, though, after this was revealed, you saw some more deliberated targets of the next versions of ransomware towards hospitals. So there is ways to make money, and I hope to show a slide, just not for too long, that I use in my CMU course, where we kind of map out which adversaries are you likely to face for your industry, and in which priority. So you don't want to fix every vulnerability, as we were discussing earlier. You want to fix the ones that could be a consequential failure to your organization's mission. And that way we're not looking at like fixing every little thing on our website. We're looking at which failures, what's the cost of wrong for certain types of failure conditions. So on this one, yeah, there's plenty of money in doing this. But the thing is, I've been studying adversary classes and motivations for a very long time, and one thing that criminals are really, really good at is not provoking a law enforcement response. And if you stay under their threshold, and if you haven't paid attention to this, every time the FBI talks to your local InfraGard chapter, they'll tell you what it is. As long as you stay below their threshold, they can never chase their flow caseload. So really good criminals, of which most of them are really good now, they know the safe zone in which is acceptable losses and behavior. And many of them would not deliberately hit hospitals, because as soon as they start killing people, they will provoke a law enforcement response, an international one. So it's not really good math to try to target health delivery organizations. So there's a little bit of a spike, and if you get somebody drunk from one of the antivirus labs, they'll tell you there has been a bit of a spike in the targeting of medical, but they're not going to breach a threshold where they provoke a response. But yes, they are a threat actor. In fact, there's one of the reports I just saw shows that PHI, street price, is going way up. So there's a lot more deliberate targeting of healthcare information. The thing is, though, we're not the cyber privacy movement, we're the cyber safety movement. So we're trying to make sure that there's plenty of consciousness in the community to focus on privacy. There's HIPAA, there's high tech, there's a lot of focus there. There's almost no focus until we got on the scene on cyber safety. But to the government's credit, I mean, the one representative, they only have 20 people in this task force, and they picked us to be kind of a voice of the white hat. I mean, the fact that they asked for white hats at all is freaking amazing. And they picked this group to try to be that voice, I think, because we've proven we can be more collaborative. But they're not ready yet for this. They're trying to initially grapple with that fact. So yeah, you could do it. But I'm not saying they would always honor it, but Chinese could do this, the Russians could do this, the Israelis could do this, the French could do this. They all have the capability to do it. But it's means, motive, and opportunity. And we have conventions and treaties like not hurting non-combatants and things like that. And people violate them all the time, but we also have a mutually assured destruction thing. So I'm not saying we're safe from those actors. I'm saying that the one that concerns me most about triggering that crisis of confidence is accidents and ideological adversaries.
To the accidents point, if you have something that's meant to steal banking credentials and it gets onto a medical device and it's so poorly written that it crashes the medical device, you don't have to imagine that someone's going after that medical device. And what I say is malice is not a prerequisite for harm.
Great line.
So I can definitely see where cyber criminals trying to steal PHI, for instance, could inadvertently kill people. But it doesn't mean that they have to try.
Yeah, and we're kind of hoping someone cries BS here, but the thing is, like, most of my career I've been looking at new adversary classes and motives and what they do and how they're thinking, and it sounds like someone's about to cry BS. All right.
Question. We're kind of knowing a little bit about the attacks on the hospitals in the U.S., and you talked about the reaction that could happen, et cetera. But you also mentioned China and Russia. Have we seen similar ransomware attacks on Russia hospitals or Chinese hospitals, and how have they reacted, and how are they able to engage with it?
The question for the camera is, have we seen, and by the way, anybody at any time can ask us to shut this off, and I won't reveal who asked it if you want. I have no knowledge as to if there's any difference in propagation by country for China or Russian hospitals. We do know that one of the reasons the U.S. is particularly vulnerable is we have private medicine. So some of the more centralized local ones, they're still vulnerable, but they have more span of control and can make more consistent reactions. So in some cases, it's to our disadvantage because we have a very fragmented population of.
When you go back to D.C., you might want to check on that.
Well, I definitely think it's a great question. We know that some of the penalties for hacking in different countries do affect the prominence of attacks. This particular one was an accident. No one was targeting the hospital. They were targeting JBoss, which is in a lot of places.
So, did you have an announcement?
No, I'm just going to offer the
okay.
microphone to people who have questions.
That's a great point.
Good idea.
If only we leveraged our audiovisual people.
The guys in the orange shirts are smart, by the way.
So the announcement is, if you'd like to talk into a microphone for your question, we have him.
There's been nothing in the news, you were saying.
Yeah, there's been nothing in the news about any Chinese or Russian hospitals experiencing it. And from what I understand, those organizations are behind where U.S. is. They're looking to us to understand what to implement in systems, and so they're further behind, and so they don't have a lot of those. They're still working on paper. They're in those kinds of conditions.
I know someone I can ask your very question of. I just can't do it in real time. But maybe after lunch I'll know the answer. I know someone I could ask.
And you're very right about other countries being somewhat behind in terms of technology, and that's one of the things that in talking with policymakers and others in D.C., when you start to ask them, what do other countries have to lose versus what we have to lose, it's pretty clear that we are the most highly exposed, the most highly dependent, and the most highly prone to this, and other countries have less repercussions. So when certain military people say, well, it's like mutually assured destruction. We could take out their systems, they could take out ours, that's how we know we won't. The math doesn't work quite that way.
This is an incredibly key point, and if you haven't been following us for a while, let me just remind you, our organizational problem statement from day one was this: our dependence unconnected technology is growing faster than our ability to secure it in areas affecting public safety and human life. And I chose that word very carefully after spending enough time with Dan Geer. One measure of security is how dependent you are on something. And if it's not dependable, you can either make it more dependable, which is incredibly costly and will take a lot of time, or you can depend upon it less. So what we really want is to never place more dependence on something than it is worthy of. And the U.S. is asymmetrically more dependent on IoT and modern technology than others are. I think healthcare is a good example of that, but we're not the only ones. There's much more modern medicine in other places and for certain types of things. But we are more heavily dependent. One more thing, there's a great graphic novel that I bring up, and it hasn't clicked for anybody why. It's called Why, The Last Man. And it does a thought experiment where every man on Earth, except for one guy, just dies. And it shows what happens, like the domino, the branches and sequels and the cascading effects. And it shows, like, the next person in line to be president is like the Secretary of Agriculture, because they're so far down the line at the time this was written for women in government. And it shows how many pilots died, how many surgeons died, how many of this. So it kind of amplified inequalities different places. And one of the more stunning things it revealed was the most dominant fighting force on Earth remaining. Can you guess where it was? Israel. Why? Compulsory service for men and women. So I'm not trying to make a feminist point. I'm trying to show that the variations in how dependent we are on connected technology will mean that even though we're all equally vulnerable globally, we're not equally dependent. And we are one of the most dependent countries. And this isn't a U.S.-centric movement, but the U.S. is one of the most dependent countries on very fragile IT.
Yeah, just wanted to make a comment about, I've certainly traveled a lot around the world, and I've unfortunately gotten sick in a lot of places around the world and have had to just kind of get local health care. And I can tell you, while there are certainly plenty of places that have more advanced medicine than us, that is not the norm. And the devices that I was put under to verify, pulse and EKG and whatever, promise you none of those had an IP address. So I think there's also a little bit of a lag, right? I think there's a little bit of a lag of how big of a problem this is in many other parts of the world, as well as the sensitivity to how big of a problem that would be perceived even if something were to go wrong. So would a response to a compromised medical device in sub-Saharan Africa be the same as the response to that sort of thing in the U.S. from a public perspective? And I suspect the answer is not yet, and we'll probably get there. And another analogy is if you take a look at what happened with SWIFT, the global banking network for money movement, it's also not by accident that they targeted Bangladesh, Vietnam, and places around the world where there are much, much more lax standards around the IT environment where those systems would be operating. So again, I think it's also opportunistic, right? They go after the areas where there's going to be less law enforcement. It's going to be easier to execute the attack. You can get plenty rich without, like Josh mentioned, kind of alerting the big boys and getting their attention. So a lot of it is just opportunistic, right?
Yeah, and we still have all the old adversaries. We're just trying to say that we have some newer ones too. And one of, I have to go upstairs briefly for a few minutes. But let me just try to make one more point before we take more audiences. I've been skipping this, but when Jericho and I spent 2.5 years researching these guys, everyone that had researched them prior got attacked. But we did it kind of in a humble way. We wrote this Building a Better Anonymous series, and we kind of engaged them in a dialectic. And now the public knows tons more. But one of the things we said on the very first slide that we had Mardu from the 303 group was we said we're less concerned about Anonymous and more concerned about the blueprint that can be picked up and perfected by others. So what comes next? If they're like an emergent property of hyperconnectivity, if it's showing how much power the individual has to use for any motivation in the human condition, what will come next? And if you've been watching the news, the people basically are, darn it. Basically, it's kind of undeniable that ISIS has perfected the blueprint of social media and asymmetric use of the internet. They're doing a much better job with it than Anonymous was, because what Anonymous lacked was a consistent ideology. So, the U.S. intelligence apparatus is dumbfounded at how a Silicon Valley innovation has been perfected by, one of our more unpredictable enemies. And, we tend to dismiss this stuff as fun, but I think you guys are adults, so we can talk about the reality here. And let's just make it really grounded. There were only like 4 or 5 pockets of actual hackers in Anonymous. There was Cabin Crew, there was Lulzsec, Antisec, there was Team Poison. And one of the better hackers in Team Poison was Junaid Hussain, the UK citizen. He's the one that defaced all the stuff for Tony Blair. Very well educated. CNN's doing a documentary on him right now. He went to like a really genius prodigy kind of primary school. He radicalized some point after our research was done. He moved from the UK to Raqqa. He's being paid dollar for dollar, the same as they pay their military leaders. Dollar for dollar. I'm less concerned that they're starting to use more IT and more concerned that they value them equal to combatants in their pay structure. And he was recruiting and training people. And you all know the kind of stuff you can find on Shodan. You all know the hard-coded passwords you can Google search and Google Derp for. You all know if we can see it on the internet, we can probably do it. And one of the things that the ICS hackers tell you is, you don't need to hack these things. You just do a Nessus scan and you'll crash them. And if you're not trying to have stealth and persistence and exfiltration and lateral movement like we've all conditioned ourselves to think about for the confidentiality of data, if your goal is to deny service of a medical service or to denial service, to kill switch an ambulance, if your goal is an availability attack, that's all you have to do. So the barrier to entry is incredibly low to cause harm. So if you look at the relative talent of someone like Junaid Hussain, it's down here versus a Russian criminal or a nation-state attacker with a nation-state budget. But the difference is these guys lack the motivation or will to do it for a bunch of reasons, and they can. But these guys, while not talented, are much more willing to assert themselves. And this again, is your third invitation to cry BS on this. But what we have between Hollywood Presbyterian is an existence proof that an accident can cause a denial patient care. And what you have in TRIC was his handle, TRICK. What you have in TRIC is an existence proof of someone who is willing and able to do it. So when you think about the means, motive, and opportunity, the motivations are as varied as they are in the human condition. So out of 7 billion people, maybe Bo will talk about his Drake equation later, out of 7 billion people on the planet, and we know about somewhere between 1% and 4% are sociopaths, we're hoping that none of those people ever notice that they can use Shodan and Metasploit to take down a hospital. I don't like those odds. You have to have a lot of faith in humanity. I mean, hell, do we even know of any sociopath hackers? You probably drank with one at the bar last night. Think about a few high-profile hackers that we know are sociopaths. Just here this week. And I don't think it's going to require malice. Some of our friends that are like trying to embarrass some of these things, they'll just post stuff on Shodan and hope no bad guy's going to say, oh, look, I can do that. It might be an accident. We might be the very thing that causes this first loss of life. We wrote a position on disclosure on the Cavalry site, and if you have even 3 minutes, please read it. I started off by stealing from Nietzsche. I said, he's got this line, whoever fights monsters should see to it he himself does not become one. I said, those concerned with public safety and human life should take great care not to inadvertently put them at risk. And it kind of messes with all my training, right? I've been doing this a very long time, as many of you have. And I've kind of had certain entrenched beliefs about disclosure. And now that we're looking at forever days in safety critical industries, it gets more complicated. So, this bothers me. The other thing about health delivery, which we should pick up on later, is it's not that it'll happen, it's that the response time is really, really ugly. And I do not have time to tell you why yet, but we will today. It's really, really ugly. And it's not my opinion. The task force has been talking about it every meeting about how many years. So first of all, it's measured in years. But it's more like 15 years from when we have our big catastrophic moment till we can have something slightly more defensible. And one of the reasons for that, I'll just get this jab in, one of the reasons the U.S. has a self-inflicted problem is with the HITECH Act, we attached reimbursement to something called meaningful use, which had lots of good reasons to do it. But what it did is it took a bunch of devices that were never threat modeled or designed to be connected to anything and it forced them to slap on connectivity to be connected to everything. So none of them were really ready for this level of connectivity. So we kind of forced ourselves to be more exposed than maybe other countries. And if you think the US is prone for those reasons, they are. But what's even worse is when we finally let go of those Windows XP systems that we're clutching from our cold, dead hands, they have very long secondary lifespans in other parts of the world, like BRIC countries, like Brazil, Russia, India, China, and other places, who would kill to get that XP device. So, Bo, you want to pick up from here?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be back.
Not sure what's in your slide deck,
Nothing.
so I'll probably
Don't use it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then I'll put this down.
Yeah.
So, where should I start? One of the critical things that Josh kind of alluded to, and is my mic on? I can't hear myself. Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me in the back? All right. There we go. Maybe I'll just do this. Maybe it's cutting out. I don't know. All right. So one of the things that really kind of disturbs me is when I go and talk to, about 3 weeks ago, I was in Germany talking to, we called it the IT Security for Vehicles Conference. And it was a bunch of German automakers who were there to learn about security in vehicles. It was a really good conference, and over the course of 2 days, a lot of people said a lot of things like we're saying here today, and the automakers were like, yes, this is all very good. We're learning something. And a lot of the folks in the room were part of the security groups within the automakers, which is really encouraging to see those security groups standing up within automakers. The OEMs, the car brands like BMW, as well as the tier ones like Bosch, like Continental. But one of the common themes is when I was talking about the timeline to respond, the German automakers were saying, well, yes, it takes time to do security right. We want to get it right because we're German. It's a very German thing to want to take our time and be deliberate and get it right. I said, okay, that's great. So how long is long enough? Well, standards processes, they take a couple of years to brainstorm and then define, and then once you've defined them, it takes a couple of years to get them into some of the designs that we're going to do because there's revisions. And then once we get them into the designs, it takes a couple of years to get them into specs and RFPs, and then out to vendors, and then a couple of more years to get it from the vendor into our designs, and then a couple of more years to get it into the cars. I said, okay, so what does it look like? What's the timeline between when you know that you have an urgent need and when the first car rolls off the assembly line? Like, it can be 7 or 8 years. So 7 or 8 years between when you know you have a problem that you need to address and when you can actually get one car on the road, let alone the fleet of them. And going by the math of 7 to 11 years in production, you could have a 20-year lag where you've got huge exposures of the car fleet. And they're quicker than medical. They're quicker than oil and gas. They're quicker than nuclear. So in one of our best poised industries, it would take 20 years to fix these problems. And then I said, okay, well, as you're taking your time and being very deliberate with security, how many of you are putting in app stores? Oh, all of us. Running on Android and connected to the brakes. How many of you are putting in 4G, LTE, Wi-Fi hotspots? Oh, all of us. Okay, again, plugged in, connected to the entertainment system, which is connected to the brakes. So you're adding all of these things very, very quickly in much less time than you can actually put in any security framework, let alone one that's specific to those. So now we're racing ahead with the exposure and lagging behind with the security of that exposure. And then you've got things like third-party dongles, which anyone can plug in. They can go and buy it today and plug it into a car that is properly isolated from the internet, that doesn't even have a Wi-Fi connection or a 4G connection, no app store, and you can turn it into a vulnerable, exposed device. So as you're going slow and getting this right, which is a good thing, you're also leaving yourselves exposed and vulnerable. And they had to think about it for a while because they're Germans and they're very deliberate in their thinking and their actions. But even more than that, I said, as we heard yesterday, 35,200 lives lost per year on American roads, 94% of those are due to human error. Somebody falls asleep, somebody turns or into a lane of oncoming traffic accidentally, somebody runs a red light because they're not paying attention. 94% of those 35,200 deaths per year on American roads are caused by just human error, which is why NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, is rushing so hard and so fast towards autonomous vehicles. They saw the one fatality so far that's happened, and they said, this is not going to deter us, it's not going to stop us from pushing ahead with this, because we're losing about 80 lives a day due to preventable things that autonomous vehicles could do. So a single death across the entire time that we've had autonomous vehicles, which is not a very long time, is less, much less than 80 people per day. So as you're slowing down to do security deliberately, you're putting at risk 80 people's lives per day. And when you start talking to policymakers, start talking to automakers, start talking to others, these are the balances that they think in terms of. So while we all think one death is a tragedy, it's a shame and it shouldn't happen, especially a preventable death, the reality is that if we go too slowly, if we try to be too deliberate with these things, we're actually putting people at risk. And this is the same in medical as well. So if I started out my career in a hospital, I was an IT guy, and then I was an InfoSec guy. And what I learned pretty quickly is that whenever I take $1 to do something security related, I'm stealing $1 from patient care. And that weighs pretty heavily on a lot of medical device makers' minds. I know some of the people that I've talked to who are medical device makers have that same philosophy. It also weighs pretty heavily on the hospitals' minds. People who are in hospitals think about that a lot. So as we're trying to do security, we're taking money away from the place where it actually helps people. So if we do security wrong, in one way, if we do no security, there will be harm to patients, there will be harm to drivers, to passengers. If we go the other way and we do too much security, then we'll be stealing money from the people who can actually get the benefit from it. On the other side, and this is in a FDA workshop in January, we were talking about some of these problems in medical devices and in hospitals, and someone came up to the microphone and he said, we've already been doing information security for a long, long time. We've got things we know work. Why couldn't we just apply PCI to medical devices? And just about everybody wanted to get up and punch him, because that would be the stupidest thing we could do, because Josh often calls PCI the No Child Left Behind Act for security, right? It's highly prescriptive. All the major merchants that have been breached have been compliant, so it doesn't even work the way that we think it works. Whether you believe it has some value or not, to apply it to medical devices would be catastrophic. So what happens if we put a strong 12-character password with multi-factor authentication on a defibrillator device? How long will it take a physician to access that device and use it? Probably a long time. Is it longer or shorter than the time it takes to save a life with that device? Probably shorter, maybe, in most cases. What happens if they forget their password or they forget their second factor authentication? Well, then you just have an acceptable loss. The patient died, so you could have PCI on medical devices. So while we've optimized PCI in most of our IT security controls for a data protection or data confidentiality solution space, trying to apply these same types of things into operational technology or Internet of Things or cyber safety systems is a problem space that is human life integrity or human life availability. So even if we took the best, most perfect IT security standard and applied it directly on top of these new technologies, again, going back to why IoT is different and why safety systems are different, we'd have a fundamental mismatch. If we got it perfect, we would still fail. So this is one of the things that, for me personally, I've had a kind of a journey on in the last few years. Is I used to think we were bad, but getting better. I used to think that we could take some of the things that we knew and apply them, and now I'm not so sure about that. I think we probably need to go back and question some of the very fundamental assumptions that we have. Do we want to have antivirus running in our cars? Does anyone? No. Do we want to have firewalls in our cars? A couple of people, so maybe that's a good thing. Do we want to have mandatory access control versus discretionary access control models in our medical devices? Well, I don't even know how to answer that, right? So these are the types of things that we need to be thinking about as we're going through in the safety domain. Right.
They're
Right.
actually making checklists from well-meaning consultants that ask medical devices to do the very thing that causes impediment to patient care.
Yep, you're absolutely right. So the point made was that regulations and things like HIPAA, things like high tech, are causing the types of checklist-based data confidentiality controls that will put patient safety at risk. And that's absolutely right. But in the absence of someone from our community standing up and saying, hey, we've got to rethink this, let's move forward with something better, that's all they kind of can do. That's all they know, right? If you go talk to policymakers, they would probably say, PCI has been a smashing success. We should definitely apply that to medical devices. Because they don't know these things the way that we know them, right? They know them in their own terms, which is very broad, very macro. And that's one of the risks as DC starts to look to DEF CON, a different DC, and ask, what is it that we can do? How can we be better? We have to ourselves know what we can do and how we can be better. And then we have to flip that. So we have to engage with them in a trustful way and set aside maybe some of your political differences, set aside the fact that a lot of us think that maybe regulation is absolutely wrong for anything, and understand that if this is coming, if we can't avoid it, then the best we can do is try and harness it and at least prevent it from doing harm. So one of the things that Josh mentioned is, has anybody heard the Drake equation? Does anybody know what that is? Drake, a couple of people. So the Drake equation is a physics thing, and it's essentially a mathematical model to emerge philosophical ideas. And the idea is the Drake equation should calculate, you should be able to calculate the number of intelligent species in the universe, in the entire universe, that we can communicate with. And then the observation is we can calculate that number, and most of the calculations we come out to say that there should be some intelligent species that we're communicating with. And then the conclusion from that is, where the hell is everybody, right? We've got all of these billions and billions of galaxies, billions and billions of stars, billions and billions of planets. On some of those, some life form should have emerged that we could communicate with. Yes? Right. So there are many, many different elements to the equation, and one of them is longevity, right? How long does an intelligent species have to be around before they can communicate with us within our 100-year lifespan of being able to actually communicate back with them? But I looked at some of the things that we have to believe in security to say that we will never have a catastrophic failure, a cyber crisis on the scale that reaches a national security level, or some other type of level that we would agree is horrendously bad for society. I said, this sounds a lot like the Drake equation. So what if we came up with a cyber Drake equation? And maybe we can just spend a few minutes. I'll steal Josh's computer since he left it unlocked, and pull up the Drake equation, if I can. Well, Well, now we've got a black screen. Oh, there we go. So let's see if there's a browser tab I can open. Okay, well, we failed on that. But maybe we can go through and just think, if there were such a thing as a cyber Drake equation, what might it look like? In the Drake equation, you take the number of stars across the entire universe, across all of the galaxies, and you say, of those stars, what are the percentage that have planets? What are the percentage of those that are habitable by life forms? What are the percentage of those life forms that could develop intelligence? You kind of progress that way. So I would say that the cyber Drake equation might start with, what are the number of people on the planet, right? So number of people on the planet, and then we could ask, what are the percentage of those people who have the knowledge to be able to pull off something like a large-scale attack? So of the percentage of people who have the knowledge, how many would, right? What's the willingness or the motivation? And then of those with the knowledge and the motivation, how many are aware of these things? And then knowledge, motivation, awareness, what else could we say? Means, motive, opportunity. Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. So the means would be the technical expertise, right? Technical expertise.
There's the expertise and then the ability to access.
Yes, so somebody, of the 7 billion, only maybe 5 billion actually can get to the internet. So that's a good limiting factor. And Steve, I'm assuming you're writing these things down because you're
Not particularly well, sorry.
okay. Yeah, no problem.
I don't know if expertise necessarily or knowledge necessarily applies here, because you had a point earlier in the presentation where they had sought out a hacker and radicalized him. So they may not necessarily need the expertise or knowledge so much as the opportunity to get somebody and recruit them, right?
Yeah, so there's resources that you could put towards getting the expertise, right? So that would still be means. Or you could say, you could make it really easy and say, if you've got the means to download Metasploit, then you have the means, right? So there's the means. Motive. I studied psychology in college, so there's a certain percentage of the global population that are sociopaths, and people disagree on what that number is, but in general, it's agreed that it's between like 0.3% and 5%. So that's across the 5 billion people who can get to the internet, that's a non-zero number. It's actually a pretty high number, total numbers. Then opportunity. So this is where we're talking about access to the internet. There's also a awareness factor. So people who know about these systems know that they could use Shodan. Oh, maybe don't put stuff up there.
Yeah, I'm just putting it back to presentation.
What are you trying to do?
Just presentation.
Okay, yeah, there you go. Okay. So we've talked about the actor side. What about on the other side? What about devices? Right, so if you're going to have actors, they're going to have to act on something. So if they act on something, then there has to be a dependence there, right? Because if we're talking about software that doesn't go into the physical stack, right? If it's just a server sitting off on the side of the road somewhere that's not doing anything, if it's not connected into an automotive system, if it's not connected into a medical system, then it doesn't matter. You can hack it all day long, all you're going to do is maybe set up a spam bot, right? So you have to have a software system that is dependent. So of all the software systems out there, which ones have a dependence, or which ones are connected to something that matters? Then you have to have a vulnerability. But we know that all software code has vulnerabilities. It's just the degree to which those are exploitable. And we have ways to figure those out and to measure those. Then there's exposure. It's got to be plugged into the internet, basically, for all 5 billion people to touch it. If it's not plugged into the internet, you can reduce that space, so maybe it's only 1,000 people, let's say. But for the moment, maybe let's just keep that at plugged into the internet and connected directly. What other types of things do we need to know on the system side? The effects of the system, yeah. So what would be the total impact? Is it something, and I think it might make sense to keep it to, is this something that would cause a societal level impact, or does it not reach that threshold? But we can talk through that. Yes.
I think that's really, really important when we talk about medical devices and infrastructure. So I work in a hospital, and every day when I see patients being taken care of, it amazes me how flexible certain healthcare delivery organizations can be in delivering the same amount of care. And I think we have to be very careful, and this is an uncomfortable truth. We're all in the business of talking about vulnerability, 0 days, let's own them, or oh, that sounds really horrible. Let's talk about what the implication could be for a patient harm. But we have to really understand that there's quite a bit of medical devices that are completely compromised and have very little impact on patients.
Right.
And that might be despite what you think they do or what Hollywood says they do. If you compromise the defibrillator, maybe it would only compromise the telemetry unit, and that the ability to still deliver a shock is intact. Well, there's 15 other telemetry units right next to the patient that are different devices. I mean, they're already connected to 2 other ones. So if the EKG failed on the defibrillator device at bedside, it wouldn't matter. But we all like to think, oh, I compromised the defibrillator. It must mean that that patient's going to die, because every time I've watched an episode of ER, that's a really important piece of medical device, and they need to shock him to live. Well, you have to really understand that maybe the exploit doesn't have anything to do with the capabilities to defibrillate a patient.
Right.
So we need to be able to really be honest with ourselves about what the impact of this is. And frankly, a lot of us lack the understanding of patient care, physiology, and the impact of the patient to be able to make that call. I think you need to be able to talk to people who do. For instance, if you compromise the patient's laboratory device and they were unable to get labs, for a vast majority of patients, that would not matter.
Right.
For 97% of the patients in the hospital, not being able to get labs on a patient for a day until they figure out a solution because you'd ransomwared their laboratory machines downstairs would not matter. And they often, other hospitals will have capabilities to, if it really did matter, if there's a critically ill patient in the ICU on a vent and you needed to know what their acid pH was, that you could get that by a handheld device that that probably was not compromised in the same attack. However, I would like to draw attention to that there are systems of care that are very fragile that we should probably be focusing our attention to, because they are device agnostic, right? Every hospital relies on these processes, and the ability for all the patients in the hospital to be affected by them are very, very real.
So if you, for instance, turned off the refrigeration for the penicillin, where that's kept, and the penicillin spoiled, that would affect almost all of the patients at a hospital.
Well, there's 15 other antibiotics. There's 15 other antibiotics in the pharmacy that have the same coverage as penicillin.
Okay.
That don't require
Don't require
refrigeration.
refrigeration.
And that's something that is important that we talk about, right? Because we think about that penicillin's a life-saving antibiotic. A patient has an infection that needs an antibiotic. If I take out the refrigerator and all those drugs are dead, then those patients are dead. That probably is not true.
And that's because how are we supposed to know as hackers which antibiotics need to be refrigerated and which ones don't?
Right.
And which antibiotics cover which infections? That's not what we're trained for. That's not what we study. We don't give a shit about that.
Yeah.
Nor should we. But what I think it offers is an opportunity to talk to clinicians, talk to healthcare practitioners and say, hey, what are the low-hanging fruits here? What if this device failed? I know it's a defibrillator. I know it's really dramatic. I know I'm supposed to shock a patient back to life with it, and it sounds like it's important. What if this machine went out? What would happen? They might say nothing. I'm going to grab the defibrillator that is not connected to the internet 3 feet from it. That is an opportunity for us to talk with healthcare providers and say, well, what if this other machine failed? That would be catastrophic. You would see patients all across the hospital be impacted, and you would see patients die.
Yeah.
No one's going to. You can't glean that from a Wikipedia article, and frankly, it's not worth our study. It's worth the collaboration. Let's identify these targets that are really dangerous, the ones that matter, the ones that impact patient health care, and that's going to require a team of us. It's going to require, I am the cavalry, all the stakeholders coming together, identifying these things, and let's get rid of the really serious, scary ones first.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And so I want to dig into that point a little bit more because I think there's a good opportunity to talk about some of those things. I think for right now, let's capture that as impact in the cyber Drake equation. And you had something you wanted to ask?
Not just like a denial of service thing, but like you said, like what about penicillin? Well, what if you just got into the EMR and made everybody who's allergic to penicillin not? Or if you got into the prescription drug medications and turned everything from like where it thinks it's 1 cc, it's 1,000 cc's.
Right.
You know, you can be a lot more malicious without having to just take something down. And it also kind of goes back on his point about knowing what specifically can cause an issue. Like with a pharmacy machine, if you know it's compromised, you have pharmacists who can manually do it, but you got to know.
Right.
You know, otherwise it's just a scan on a bracelet, a scan on a tube, and away you go.
Yeah, you're right. The impact has to be measured and measurable, and we have to know what that impact is. I like the comment earlier about the timeline. So over what timeline are we talking about? And if we have that as one of the factors, that might be like, you know, a year or 10 years, or the way I like to think about this one is essentially if you might have this type of thing happen within the lifespan of the vulnerable system, you know, the dependent, vulnerable, connected system, then that's a good way to talk about it. Yes?
Could you clarify quickly what you mean by timeline?
Right.
There's multiple interpretations.
Right. So over what timeline would an actor need to act on a device to cause the societal level catastrophe that would kind of trigger or precipitate something like a loss of trust in government, a loss of trust in the public health system, a loss of trust in connected vehicles and autonomous vehicles. So one of the interesting parts of this equation is that if you can use it to explain and to dig into exactly those types of things, right? What is the impact? How do we know that that's the impact? How do we know that this is the ground truth? What information do we have that supports it? What happens if that's taken down? Then we can analyze those things. But one of the interesting parts of a thought experiment that I like doing with people is saying, all right, if we assume, and this is particularly powerful with policymakers, if we assume that the number of these cyber crises will be zero, that means that one element in this equation must also be zero, because that's the only way you can get to a truly zero number, especially when you're starting with a number like 7 billion people on the planet. So let's peel into which one of these might be zero. And that's when you can start to get to those things like impact. If, for instance, there's a downtime procedure for every single thing, and we have the ability to detect an attack, then, okay, the number might be zero because the impact is zero. We've already thought about the backup systems and processes, and we've got that worked out. And as we saw in Ukraine, when part of the power grid went out for about 6 hours. before they were able to go in and use manual backups to turn the power back on, to get the lights back on, to get everybody up and working. So where a bunch of people point to the Ukrainian power grid outage that was caused by attackers, and there's actually video of the cursor moving on the screen. The guy who was at the control terminal, by the way, took out his cell phone and recorded the cursor moving on his screen without him using it and clicking to shut down the things. So we know that this was an intentional act and intentional action. Pretty clear evidence there. So when something like that, that's an intentional action, only takes out power for 6 hours, that doesn't rise to the level of impact that we really need to be concerned about it. So that's a great one to talk about. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, I was going to build off of what he said. Part of what you're getting into is how we deal with exceedingly finite resources.
Right.
And so there's a hospital system on the East Coast that I would name that's very sophisticated in their ability to be able to understand the exploitability of threat versus the existence of threat. But for every one of those, there's dozens that are panicking and saying fix everything. Right? They run a simple scan, and they're trying to fix. They run a simple scan on an unconnected device, totally unconnected device, and say, I see this minor vulnerability, fix it all. There's finite resources, and
Right.
you need people working on a connected device. It is highly directed correlation there. It is diagnostic support on the critical exploitable vulnerabilities. But the demand is coming to the device manufacturer. No. Fix it all. Fix everything. You can't. You're exceedingly limited in your
Yeah.
resources to do that. So driving the view of the organization. We've already identified critical infrastructure. We've already started there. These are key things we need to look at. We're ignoring a lot of other things, a lot of consumer-based things, TVs and look at everything we do. But within those critical infrastructure, we need to go a step lower. That's probably a most important next step. It's not that difficult to say most of these HDOs have very similar risk points that can be utilized system by system by system, rather than each one of them trying to recreate the wheel themselves and driving so much chaos.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. When it comes to prioritization of resources to get things fixed, that's a huge challenge. And I think when I've been talking to some of the medical device makers, talking to some of the car makers, one of the things that everyone kind of gets stuck on too is we talk about fixing future systems, but we've got so much legacy stuff out there, right? And I think people's brain get a little bit DDoSed because they think about all of the problem space, and it's just impossible to function. But one of the things that that I often tell them is, look, if you've got multiple problem sets, you might need multiple solutions. So maybe it's not that we only tackle legacy or only tackle future. If we have a plan for future, we have a plan for something like things that can't be changed that are in the system but haven't yet gone to market, we can do more with them than we can the legacy devices. Legacy devices are yet a third problem space that we need to tackle. So when we think about prioritizing those resources, how do we do that? And one of the arguments that I make is if you can invest in future devices, it will be a lot higher return on those investments, both in your ability to control the systems and your ability to do things with them. But also, when you look at the ability of those systems to come online, there's a lot more connected devices that are going to come out tomorrow than were out there yesterday. So I saw a stat from the car industry that was something like 35% of cars on the road today are connected to the internet. In 2020, 98% will be connected to the internet. So if we can fix the 98% or fix the 35%, even at an equivalent return to investment ratio, fixing the 98% is a better investment just looking at it from that standpoint. Not only that, if you can somehow get people to buy more of the future cars, you can get rid of some of the legacy. So no matter what you do to the legacy systems, you can't make them as good as a well-engineered, safer, more secure system by retrofitting. So if we can somehow incentivize people to ditch their old cars or medical devices and buy the new ones that are safer and more secure, then it might be a way to solve the legacy problem by just aging those devices out quicker, which could be a really interesting thing that we can talk about later on today or this afternoon. Steve.
So I work at the MITRE Corporation on the team that directly supports Suzanne Schwartz and the FDA at CDRH. And one of the projects that we're doing is touching quite a bit on what Christian has discussed and what you've also talked about as well, which is trying to look at CVSS and other risk-related methodologies to try and adapt it or figure out how to utilize it within a healthcare setting, to consider things such as what is the affected functionality and the safety relevance of it, tying it to the kinds of hazard analysis that medical device manufacturers already do as a result of safety considerations. And there are definite concerns about how do hospitals wrestle with this onslaught of, or this potential onslaught of vulnerabilities or concerns where everything is necessarily treated as high risk. How do you consider the additional complexities within the hospital environment of, okay, maybe there's not a patient safety component, but if it's a vulnerability that allows you to basically brick $1 million device, or there may be financial impact. There's HIPAA and privacy considerations. There are considerations of the devices in terms of how they could be used to attack other resources within the network and so on. And so a lot of these kind of questions. I know this is the problem section, but it's still our problem, basically, to try and figure out how to sort of address this. But I just wanted to make people aware that MITRE is working with the FDA to do that. I'm Steve Christie Coley, and I will be at the MedSec thing. That's the meetup on Thursday. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I want to pull on Christian's point a little bit more. What if we had a vulnerability that had zero impact in the real world, right? There was a healthcare organization in New York that when Hurricane Sandy hit, their power went out and their generators were flooded, so they didn't work. So they had to go to manual procedures for all of their patients. For some of their patients, particularly infants in the neonatal intensive care unit, it was too much, right? They had all doctors on standby, all nurses on standby. But because they had to do so many manual processes, it became infeasible to provide world-class health care to those patients. So they moved them. If the impact of a hack is only that you move a patient, sure, there's a big financial cost, but if there's no harm associated with it, do we need to kind of give up on the idea that any security problem should have the same gravitas as any other? And that might play into your prioritization point too. How do you prioritize? Can we do, this one's 20% higher, this one's 20% lower? Or do we need to say this is orders of magnitude larger and just do something like t-shirt sizes? Like, this is a triple XL priority. This is a small priority or an extra small or a petite, size 7, size 20 kind of thing.
I can give you a very tangible example.
Yeah.
DoD came out with a statement that said they will go vulnerable systems. Pretty straightforward. Use XP as an example. That it's trickles down through the government, and it hits the VA. The VA says we want no XP systems. That's not what the original directive said. It said no XP systems. Not all things that say XP are XP. There's XP embedded, so we're less than 14. VA comes down and says, I want all of these things gone. We try to
So for the camera, basically what I think that came down to, and tell me yes or no, is there are often regulations or promulgations from on high that when they get to actual implementation come out completely different from intended and cause misalignments in the way that things need to work to make things safer, more secure. Yeah, so, yeah.
I have a
yes,
point I'd like to make.
Okay.
We sort of touched on this a little before, which is that the denial of service stuff seems like it doesn't have actual life impact, like the patients can be moved or we can go and grab a different machine. What scares me with some of the hacks, and I haven't looked at the medical space, but like the hack in the refrigerator stuff is not the complete denial of service. Your refrigerator is killed. Okay, I'll go to the supermarket. It's the I'll turn it off for 3 hours, middle of the night, everything will spoil, it turns back on and you don't know. And so maybe we should be prioritizing the more sinister stuff, the stuff that gives them control of the computer and not denial of service. That's less of a concern to me.
Yeah, so, and that's a great point. There's a concept in security that we want no silent failures. And this is a perfect example of the 5-star, which I'll bring back up here. So when we say that we want forensically sound evidence capture in cars and medical devices and these other critical systems, the reason we say that is so that we have no silent failures, so that when something happens, when there is a problem, we can go and trace that back. And right now, the number of medical devices that have something like a common framework for logging critical investigatory information, the number of cars that have a common framework or standard for logging critical investigatory things is like 0. If it's more than 0, it's ones that I don't know about. And if you know about them, feel free to raise your hand and tell me I'm wrong. But when we go and see these types of things, when we see a death, and I know that Kwadi mentioned this the other day, when we see a death, the physician doesn't necessarily assume, oh, well, I need to check and see if the medical device was tampered with. They just assume that it was something in the other treatment course that probably caused that. And so when they do their morbidity and mortality, you don't look at the medical device as one of those things because you assume as a physician and as the medical establishment that it either works or it's failed, obviously. Yet that's not an assumption that we should make or can make given the standards of care that we have today. So that's where something like a forensically sound evidence capture could be incredibly powerful in cars, in medical devices, et cetera. We keep hearing the notion that there have been no deaths from hacking, and yet we also have the inability to say whether or not that's true.
So just a quick observation on your comment about denial of service. You know, in classic enterprise IT, right, it's about integrity and confidentiality much more so than availability. And for any number of devices in the medical side that can be replaced or, you know, there may be backups available, maybe denial of service isn't necessarily important. However, the risk calculus is perhaps different based on different device classes. So, for example, if it's a denial of service in a pacemaker, right, or a denial of service in, you know, in an insulin pump, then that potentially, you know, kills the patient. And so denial of service, at least in some of those contexts, becomes much more important. So the classic enterprise perspective, we may utilize a lot of the different kinds of concepts from there, but the relative prioritization may be different than what we're traditionally used to.
Yeah, so to tie that back into the central theme of emerging these uncomfortable truths, what I'm hearing is that a lot of the focus we've had so far is confidentiality and availability. We're going to look at the CIA triad and use that as a framework. So on the confidentiality side, we have lots of things that we know in IT security that work for confidentiality. We have lots of things that we know work for availability and uptime. We have lots of solutions for those, but where we're maybe critically lacking is this integrity focus. So if the integrity of the medicine goes away, you don't know that it's integral, then that becomes a real serious problem. If there's some type of a temporary impact to patient care that causes a patient to die and then it comes back online, That's an integrity of the process thing. And maybe in what we typically do in IT security, we don't have any real strong solutions for integrity. And maybe going back again to the elements of IoT and why it's different, maybe that's one of the critical pieces of the solution set that we need to be thinking about solving for, rather than necessarily just confidentiality and or availability.
Before we go there, on this point, this should be obvious, but it doesn't seem to be obvious. I sometimes have fights with some of our rock star researchers in this area because they say, well, no one could do this. You have to be as awesome as we are to do this. Like, we're the best in the world. And I think implicit in that, and I just want to call it out, because maybe I'm wrong on this, I think implicit in that is when we think about initial compromise, stealth, persistence, quiet lateral movement, many of these are hallmarks of an exfiltration of confidentiality and secrecy. But if your goal is to disrupt service, the barrier to entry to cause a blue screen or to brick something or to just disrupt availability, like I said, some of these ICS systems can't even handle a port scan. But one of the hospital guys on Thursday in Princeton said they used to scan their devices because basically most of the IT in a hospital isn't even known to the IT team. They don't even know what they have. So in an effort to scan the devices, they found they were crashing vital services. So they had this Scylla and Charybdis kind of problem where they needed to know what they had, and finding what they had caused it to die. So I think when people say it's too hard to inflict loss of life, they're forgetting that the barrier to entry for a denial of service is significantly lower than to be stealthy and highly reliable and unobservable for an APT-ish kitten killer. So again, cry BS on that, but I think we forget that.
I just want to say I completely agree with everything that's been said so far. I also want to highlight that these systems are very, very complex. And if you use your traditional thoughts of how a company operates and the motives and what they provide, et cetera, those can also be very complicated, but you know them. Healthcare is a pretty difficult thing to understand without being exposed to, without working in it, without doing patient care. It's very hard to access from the outside, to understand what the true implications of some of these hacks might be. For example, I agree, a denial of service on some devices might not matter at all, and some devices they might matter quite a bit. But the conceptions are for things like, well, what if we did a denial of service attack on a pacemaker? What would the impact be? If we all took a poll right now, a lot of people would say they'd die. I don't know if that's true. It depends entirely on what their disease is. Maybe their pacemaker is only a sensing and it only shocks their heart when they go into ventricular fibrillation. Or maybe it's there to pace them because they're in atrial fibrillation. And if you turned it off, who cares? They'll be in atrial fibrillation, and if they try to run around, they'll just get really tired. Or if we've attacked someone's insulin, they don't get insulin for 3 days. They'll go into diabetic ketoacidosis. They'll get real sick, and they'll go to a hospital, and I'll fix them. They might not die. Or if they get delivered a deadly insulin bolus, what if it's right next to one of their friends or family members who knows about hypoglycemia and they get treated? It's just the impact of these hacks are very difficult to predict, and they're not universal. Mm-hmm. Furthermore, denial of service, I think, is something those big buzz terms or whatever. But let's talk about denial of service attacks on networks of care. I completely agree that denial of service attacks on maybe a single device, et cetera, might not have tremendous amounts of patient harm. But we're talking about networks of care. The Affordable Care Act has forced hospitals, and this has been happening for a long time, to consolidate into networks of treatments. Raise your hand if you've heard about a hospital closing in the last 5 years. Yeah. Well, they happen all the time. It's because the smaller hospitals can't afford to function by themselves anymore. They don't have the infrastructure. They can't meet meaningful use. They can't pay for these systems of care to deliver high-quality health care, so they go out of business, or they sell out and join large hospital networks. Well, what do those large hospital networks do when they acquire them? They say, you're going to run our exact EMR, you're going to run our back end, all of our enterprise solutions are going to apply. What we're talking about is now the consolidation of healthcare in America to networks of care, large healthcare organizations, where if one of them gets owned, they all can get owned. And then if we're talking about, because they're all running the exact same stuff, you can do that. And then this is the important thing. If you do a denial of service on one hospital, who cares? You can divert patients to another hospital. The hospital Presbyterian hack is very scary, I agree. But when you say the word like go on divert, my hospital goes on divert all the time. because we get 13 ambulances in a trauma rollover, and our trauma resources are exhausted. We go on divert all the time. I mean, it's a weekly occurrence. Sometimes it happens multiple times
Yeah, we're
in a
concerned
week.
about hitting every hospital in a geographic zone.
So
Right.
think about an entire network of care going out. Then all of a sudden, diversion actually matters. Well, who are you going to divert to? The hospital down the street's EMR is down as well because you're running the exact same system. You're part of the same network of care. So all of a sudden, all the hospitals in the metropolitan area have the exact same issue. None of them can deliver care. Their ability to take care of patients is outstripped with a single hack, not just a coordinated, let's talk about all the different ways we can knock it out. It's kind of a scary thing, and it's only going to get worse.
And I'm not picking on any one vendor per se, but when you look at this as an epidemiological issue and you look for common mode failures and shared attack surface and shared risk, there's a few systems that are near monopolies, especially as consolidation happens. Like everybody uses Epic. So were I wanting to hurt everybody, I would target flaws in that. And there's some good security people there, and they're doing some good security things, but many of these policy choices we've made to modernize medicine and get away from paper copies and get to more sharing and get to the next stage is precision medicine, where they want to get rid of the proprietary incompatibility between these things and freely share data across large regions and practices. We are encouraging more common mode failures, more monocultures, to use a Dan Gear type term. And that magnifies and amplifies harm. Not picking on Epic, but it is one of the elephants in the room. Oh, can we please pause the... A reminder, if anybody wants to say something off the record, just give us the signal.
And can you make sure that that's cut the video feed as well as the audio feed?
yesterday is 100 of the Fortune 100 companies have lost intellectual property despite massive security teams. Like one of the banks told the HHS task force they have 500 full-time security people on staff, and they're still breached all the time. And 100% of the PCI breaches were PCI compliant that year. So, you know, we have this lie we've all bought into, which is that compliance is a good proxy for security. How many of you have heard of my H.D. Moore's Law? Oh, that's it? Darn, I gotta work harder. Everybody knows Moore's Law is compute power doubles every 18, 24 months or whatever. Let me do it this way for you. I basically said that the strength of an unskilled attacker grows at the rate of the Metasploit project. And H.D. Moore wrote Metasploit, obviously. And it's not just Metasploit. It's like Poison Ivy, you know, Kali Linux. It's you know, whatever's freely available to a script kiddie. And the way I kind of drove a dagger through the heart of PCI was I finally, after 2.5 years doing it the hard way, I said, take your PCI compliant organization that just passed today and run today's Metasploit on it. And if you can detect everything, not even prevent, if you can detect it all, then you're safe. And not a single person that passed their audit could handle even a fraction of Metasploit. So I said, if you're not stronger than the least skilled adversary, you're not strong enough for anybody.
But if the standard were written like that.
Yeah. You could fix it by saying you must, you know, here's the control objectives, not the controls. Here's the intent, not the brittle. Right?
So the electric industry started down the path of how you make compliance be security instead of compliance be letter of the law, because there was something called the 9 substation problem, where there was a report 2 or 3 years ago now that if they took out 9 transmission substations in the U.S., it would be a nationwide power outage. And so this made a lot of people panic when it was first done privately by the government. And so the FERC said, you need to make a regulation and you need to do it right now, yesterday. And the electric industry made the regulation in, I think it was 97 days, which is
unheard of.
Unheard of. The current ones we're doing, they expect to take 2 to 3 years. But they basically said, you need to hire somebody who's a third party who's qualified. They need to do a risk assessment. If that risk assessment says you need to do something, take that, go to somebody else to review it. So you got 2 outside people, and then do what the risk assessment says. And then come in, and then have a third party come in and see, did you do what the risk assessment says? And so there's really no way to go to the letter of the law. You kind of have to go to what can we do to make ourselves more secure.
I've seen those types of things fail a lot too.
Can the mics go back on? Is your mic on?
I'll turn it on. So PCI is very similar to that. If you get past the 12 things, essentially this is a risk assessment, right? Where then you have the problem of, well, are you going to pay someone who's going to fail you? And will you pay them the next year? So you're misaligning incentives there if that's the thing. And one of the things that I've observed in a lot of these spaces is like mechanical engineers who are putting together car bodies know the physics of the universe really well. They know at what rate metal will corrode in a certain environment. And it's really easy. Physics doesn't change over the course of 2 years. Security does. So any attempt to quantify that specifically and at the level where engineers are comfortable and familiar with this is doomed to fail, because essentially the physics of our universe changes every it could change tomorrow, right? It probably will change after DEF CON, right?
I mean, on the road, back to the physics point, the road doesn't start to like play chess against you and start moving. You know, we have sentient adaptive adversaries, right? So it's more game theory and psychology than it is, you know, inertia. Now, yes, there's some predictable dynamic range of social science, but it's not the same thing. I just looked at the clock. Until our scheduled break, we have a little under 30 minutes. And we seem to have some momentum. Is there an appetite for me to at least tease a non-healthcare topic? Or would people like to continue to talk about the healthcare stuff? One of the things, and this is why I'm a little hesitant myself, one of the things that Bo and I talk about is, and I did a little poll through the Cavalier account last week, we tend to believe that security through obscurity is no security at all. And when I was talking about there's zero technical barrier for somebody who wanted to shut down patient care for a whole region, there's zero technical barrier for them to do so right now for a sustained amount of time. Like, that's just the cold, hard, uncomfortable ground truth. So then we're like, well, why hasn't it happened yet? And if you saw Alan Friedman yesterday, we've had lots of arguments. Well, why hasn't it happened yet? And the means, motive, and opportunity thing is not quite comprehensive enough. The only thing they're missing is they don't know. And that's why we're really reluctant, because we want to raise attention and raise and compel action, because the recourse and the corrective loop will take 5, 10, 15 years. But we won't even start that loop until we have a failure. So I said, what happens if obscurity is all we have? And that's why my stress level has gone up lately. So as much as we've had some amazing accomplishments, and you saw from the FDA and from FTC, and you've seen some of the impacts this particular group is having, we still got a lot of these really hard problems, and I don't know how to fix them. And when we look at this, one thing that dawned on us is that when people can't see that this is a clear and present danger, instead of judging them, because we're all smart, I started asking myself, what do you have to believe to come to this conclusion that we're safe? And instead of just asking that rhetorically, if there's anybody in here that's skeptical, it's really useful through dialectic for us to surface, like, have you bought in that somebody like a Junaid could do serious harm? Is there any doubt on the exposure? You know, you look at the equation, our attack surface is approaching infinity, right? So attack surface is going up. The barriers to entry are going down through attack tools and Metasploits and Shodans, and you can buy SAM, you can buy botnets, you can rent them. The motives are as varied as they are in the human condition. So when I do that math, I get really worried, but it's possible my math is wrong. And I'm not trying to win an argument here. I'm actually kind of hoping someone gives me that little missing piece that fixes my belief so I can sleep better. But if there's a barrier, that's one of the reasons we wanted to really establish that someone like Junaid exists. And it only takes one. I mean, one of the things I said during Anonymous was they thought the root DNS servers might go down. And they said, well, no nation state would do that because they need the internet too. And I said, well, now that we're all connected to everybody else, it doesn't matter what most people would do. It matters what one would do. So either I'm being hyperbolic and need to be calmed down, or how do I generate, not just with you, but in a more scalable way, how do we generate those missing pieces of belief? These aren't rhetorical questions. I'm sorry. They probably sound that way.
There's only one thing that comes to my mind, and we were talking about the Drake equation before.
Oh, good.
And a lot of the stuff that comes out of the Drake equation is, okay, if we assume that there should be aliens, why don't we hear them, right? So the only answer I have for you is, why haven't we seen much more of this scary stuff that we all in this room are afraid of?
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, is there something that we're all missing? Is it just that people aren't that evil?
So my temporary answer, and it's not to win the argument, it's my current belief, and I'm phrasing it as a belief. I knew these hospitals were this vulnerable for a long time. A lot of you guys probably did. What changed for me was Hollywood Presbyterian. I think it shined a light on just how exposed you were. Let me contrast it a little bit. The 50-day summer of lulls that we all saw from LulzSec, our web hygiene was terrible forever. But we never saw the attacks until we did. And then once they started, they were wildly successful on all targets. So we had exposure, we lacked a threat actor. And if you add one more thing to it, because these are two separate ideas, so I think one is they don't know yet. And I was concerned that the accidental denial service changed that equation enough. And number two, I've noticed a phenomenon, maybe I'm wrong, this is the part I'm more wrong on maybe. Nobody found any problems in OpenSSL forever. We had this long-standing belief that with many eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And with published source code, if they were bugs, they would have been found by now. And when Heartbleed was found, what nobody else paid attention to is there were 41 other CVEs in that same calendar year. So you get a little drop of water in the shark circle, or if you want to use a gold rush analogy, somebody finds some gold in the hills, and there's a gold rush. This happened on OpenSSL, this happened on Bash, this happened with Anonymous taking down sites. It happens on everything. So what I see is a long period of no one finding something, The first mover does, and you see a whole bunch more bugs in that same area. And I think we have data to support that. So that's my fear. I guess let me stitch them together, because sometimes I have to talk it out loud before I even realize my own beliefs. Number one, I just don't think they know, and when I saw Hollywood Presbyterian give them a hint, I got more scared. Number two, once one does it, you see a lot more copycats. And number three, as I started looking closer at this, most failures you can do a patch, or you can shut it off, or you can take it off the internet. And our ability to respond and mitigate to this particular exposure is very protracted. So it's, we fail all the time, but we can do a fast detect and respond. And our detect and respond is terrible. So please criticize or add to any of those three things. But that's why I think things have changed for me, to your point. Who's-
I think working on the healthcare bend of this, right here, working on the healthcare bend of this, I think that when it comes to healthcare organizations, it seems to me that the motive is more variable.
Yeah.
You attack a lot of different organizations. You either want money, or you want a claim, or you want specific pieces of data. You either toss some malware that they're going to pay a Bitcoin, or you want resources, or you want control of their systems, or you want certain types of information that you have. You attack healthcare systems. Sure, you want information. You might want information, or do you want to kill someone? Or there's a lot more unknown in healthcare systems because of the specificity of the information that it requires to operate such systems. If I turn off this one command here, I don't always know what it's going to do.
Yeah.
If I turn off 10 cron jobs on 10 Linux boxes, I pretty much know what that's going to do. So there's not always a lot of research and a lot of knowledge about what you're doing in healthcare systems. So I think one part of that is motive. The other part is reward. The reward for attacking a healthcare network or healthcare systems, apart from information, or apart from a ransomware attack, is what do you get out of it? What do you get from changing someone's prescription unless you have a personal vendetta against that person? Yeah. You get less reward for that type of thing. And I think that besides those two variables, there's a few other ones as well, but those two variables, I think, aren't as targeted or aren't as poignant as attacking a lot of other types of businesses where you have a lot more knowns and a lot less variables when you're attacking. I think that that's part of the obscurity behind why healthcare networks have maybe not made as big of a splash vulnerability-wise as some others.
Yeah, there's lots of, specifically healthcare, there's lots of other reasons as well. Like when they have an incredibly oppressive burden to pass their, HIPAA type compliance, which is highly focused on health records and confidentiality. So when that's a real pain in the butt and takes a lot of time and effort away from patient delivery, they don't want to go above and beyond that, or some of them don't even know to go above and beyond that. So I don't think we have time to do this whole thing, but just so you know it exists, David Etchu is one of my favorite collaborators in my life. He and I, many years back when I was still director of security intelligence at Akamai, I got kind of tired of IOCs, like indicators of compromise, because that's really a how. But I think the most important part is a who maps to a why, maps to a what, maps to a how, and you chain them together. And with this model, I was kind of routinely spotting false flag operations that were pretending to be anonymous but were really a Russian fraud ring or something like that. And what you do is if you start with a who, then you map out your adversary classes that your organization is likely to face given what you do in the industry you're in. And then those map to a motivational structure, which is how they'll play a game and what motivates them. It might be financial, it might be being economic with their time, it might be a grievance, it might be different things. So you can't assert one set of game theory to everybody. And then within that motivational structure, they go after some subsets of the prey, right? Predators have prey. So which things do they target? Which assets in your kingdom do they target? And then, only then, what's their dynamic range of capabilities, or their TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures? And when you chain them together, what you start to realize is one of the reasons Anonymous was so effective is they weren't, that cliche of I don't have to be faster than the bear, just faster than my buddy? It's the belief implicit that an attacker is economic with their time, and even though they could get you, why would they bother? They'll just go to a softer target. But it doesn't work with target sticky adversaries, and that's one of the reasons we were so gobsmacked for 5 years. So if a nation state wants your IP and they can't get into you, they'll go attack RSA to get to you. So the target stickiness changed that cliche. And with Anonymous, they weren't nation states, but they were mad at you. You poked them in the eye, right? So what I showed is, they're going to fight differently. They don't go after credit cards. They went after web properties. They don't have every skill in the book. They had DDoS and whatever. And I teach this in my CMU course because a lot of people are still conditioned to think we should just look at, IOCs or, forensic evidence, and we'll do attribution and hack back that way. What I really like about this is I use this with executive stakeholders annually to figure out where should we prioritize our protections based on who's after us, why they're doing it, what they're after, and how they can do it. And you map your controls appropriately. I'm not turning this into a CISO workshop, but I think we should start doing this kind of thing on who are the number 1, 2, 3 adversary classes for health delivery organizations. And I don't think it's going to necessarily just be criminals or nation states. I think it will also be this newer one like Junaid. And it got very little coverage, but Anonymous did take down a hospital in Boston for a long time. They were mad at somebody. Do you remember what?
It was Boston Children's.
Boston Children's, right. Hey. Oh, we were just talking about that. You walked in the right time. So typically your blind spots and your really big catastrophic failures are when you're missing something from your purview and your belief structure. So we're not trying to scare everybody that you should be worried about cyber terrorists. But we also know that if you blindly assume that no one would do this, that's usually where you're wrong. And what I can't do is necessarily make these devices immune to attackers. But the good news in all this is the kind of attackers that are willing to do it aren't as tall as the nation states and the criminals. They're not as talented. So the finish line for this is just raise the tide line high enough to be taller than their current capabilities, instead of boiling the ocean and trying to stop every attack from everywhere. And another piece of good news is if we decide we can't secure some of these environments, that the dependence is undependable, we can also retreat a bit and connect fewer things to everything else. Oh, you're motivated. On the record?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think this got touched on a little bit when we were going through the cyber Drake equation. But another sort of uncomfortable truth that we haven't talked about yet is even with this variety of actors and motivations, I think at least in healthcare, there's a sense of what is the likelihood of any of these, of anyone actually going and launching attack? And in a sense, it's already been sort of touched on in why haven't we seen one? But we don't have any real insight into likelihoods, especially with respect to catastrophic events. Mm-hmm. So I think that also further complicates how we analyze and prioritize what the best solutions are.
So I'm going to tee up, hopefully not putting you on the spot, but we can shut off the camera if we need to. You can do a filtered version first, and then we can shut off the camera. But as we hand the mic over, some of these events that have the potential for high catastrophe, but you can't estimate or guesstimate the probability, we still do things in other parts of the world. Like, it may be a rare event that you'll have a flood or a hurricane or a multi-day power outage, but we still do disaster recovery, business continuity, crisis management exercises to see, were this to happen, what's the playbook? What should we do in response? And one of the things I'm calling for in this task force is let's run a sustained denial of service on a whole region of patient care for a prolonged period of time so we could see where we are really well prepared that we didn't realize and where we're really poorly prepared. I mean, we have power outages all the time, and to his point, diverts happen to other hospitals all the time. But what's how long can you sustain that before you start to get an aggregate back up, or before you start losing people where seconds matter, or when the ratio of humans to patient has to increase for the paper copy? So to me, I don't think we have, even if the probability, to his Drake equation, if the probability isn't 0, and you have a 1 in a million chance when you're doing several million events a day, you're going to have it on a daily occurrence. So it's still math.
And also to that, when something happens, it becomes exponentially more likely to happen again.
Yeah, the gold rush in the show.
Right,
Yeah.
that's right, the gold rush. So it's oftentimes when we look at these things, we assume likelihood follows some actuarial type pattern that you can discern. But in actuality, it's more epidemiological. You see patient 0, and then the entire vulnerable, exploitable population is affected within a very, very short period of time.
So is your response to me basically saying likelihood is not a hard problem, or?
I think guessing likelihood is very hard. I think if it's non-zero, some level of prudent preparedness is merited.
So I don't remember where I saw this, but somewhere in FDA documentation, it says, if we have seen the occurrence once, we assume we will see it again. Therefore, we treated it as if it is a major issue. Yeah. And one of the things that I think is left open there is whether or not a clinical or a laboratory environment, a staged proof of concept, counts as we have now seen it once.
And I'm not speaking for the FDA, but I know you were close to several of these conversations. It felt to me like their starting point was, well, just because it's vulnerable doesn't mean it'll hurt people. To them having this aha moment of, oh, this isn't like a defect that affects 1 in X thousand devices. It's a defect that affects all devices. And that shifted them from proof of harm as a burden. It felt like it shifted them from proof of harm to an unmitigated pathway to harm. So to tee up the question to you for your semi-public answer to start with, we've had some questions earlier this morning of, I talked about the ransomware that took out Hollywood Presbyterian patient care. I know you've had some data and some experience investigating just how widespread is the exposure to that ransomware. And for those who didn't hear me say this before, I think ransomware is a distraction. It's a payload, one of many. It's a symptom, to use a medical term, not the underlying root cause or disease. Other payloads could be, you could still use the ransomware kit and set the ransom to immediate. You could DDoS. You could do a bunch of different things. So don't latch on to the ransomware, but the exposure that enabled that ransomware, tell us when you want to shut off the camera, but tell the group how widespread it is and how repeatable it would be for someone like a Junaid Hussain to do.
Fairly trivial, right? So the exposure, I think what you said as far as making sure that ransomware, making sure you don't focus on the ransomware, but focus on the fact that ransomware was just a payload, but more focus on that the vulnerability was widespread, and how widespread is it essentially was the question. The last scans of the internet gave us several million, didn't they, for that particular vulnerability?
I didn't share any stats because I didn't want to get it wrong.
I don't want to get it wrong either, but I'm fairly certain it's several million. I'd go check my sources before. I just came off the airplane, so I didn't know this was going to happen. Yeah, so several million, and not all of them were hospitals.
Right.
And it could have been anything. It didn't have to be ransomware. That's just what the bad guys chose to deploy that day.
And which vulnerability are you referring to?
The Java deserialization vulnerability? Yeah. JBoss? Where do you want to go with this?
Well, and we also know that the Java deserialization issue is not limited to JBoss.
It isn't limited to
JBoss.
JBoss.
Foxgloves in Apache Commons collections, and maybe some of my friends.
Yeah, so the scans that I was referring to, where I was talking about several million, were just referring to scans for the JBoss problem. When we broadened this out to all the Java deserialization, I'm not even sure we could reasonably scope it. Of all the things, right?
Before I left where I was working, one of our quick analyses of which parts of the Java open source ecosystem leveraged the deserialization technique, and I believe it was 2,200 projects.
Yeah, camera.
Can we shut the camera off for a minute, please? And kill the mics.
That's fine.
All right, so I guess this morning was really trying to focus on some uncomfortable truths. I didn't even get to raise one of the ones that scares me even more than the hospitals. But the goal was not to try to jump to solutions, but to maybe confront us with some of these things to get us in a mindset where we're more motivated to look for the really big things. And the slide I don't have time to pull up is yesterday I showed the slide from the Martian movie where he says he's going to have to science the shit out of this, right? Like, there's not enough food, there's not enough time, he's not going to live, but he uses his intuition and his innovation and ingenuity to stay, in the fight. We have solved really big problems when we have a grand challenge. We have the Manhattan Project, we had the space race, we have the moonshot. When we prioritize something, we can catalyze massive innovation, and often that innovation for one purpose can be reused to stimulate, private sector and whatnot. And what I'd like to do, if people are somewhat motivated, is definitely get some good food in your belly, come back, and let's try to talk about how we might science the shit out of this. And it's not just science, it's going to be, hold our nose, eat our lima beans, and maybe talk about legislative work or insurance work or things that are a little wonky, but get really creative. If you look back the last 15 years, the things that really took a bite out of bad stuff were things like DEP and ASLR. They were things like having home Wi-Fi routers, just one step removed from publicly addressable things. If you look historically, the things that had the biggest impact, they weren't obvious at the time. So how do we take that spirit, do some really creative brainstorming and uncomfortable brainstorming and controversial ideas with no consequences during lunch and when we get back from lunch? Because we now have a platform to talk to Congress people. We are working with some of the more clueful ones. One of our best relationships is a Congress staffer with tattoos and has a programming background and is tech literate and knows that they can bring us any topic at any time. We will find the world's best person on the subject who can also speak to Congress. And when they screw up, we just translate a little bit. It's necessary but insufficient, but until that's there, I look at this as a terraforming exercise where we don't have a breathable climate yet, but we're building a breathable climate so that we could capitalize it when we need to. So for now, I'd say thank you for coming this morning. I know it was a bit unstructured, but this morning was only to stimulate us to have really bold ideas when we get back. So thank you, and we'll talk to you later.
Thank you, everyone. We're back on here at 2, right? So the stream will be back on then as well. Sorry we cut out, and we will probably cut out again this afternoon at time. But thank you to all of our sponsors as well. Amazon, Protivity, Verisprite. I'm probably forgetting a few, but all of our sponsors are awesome. And see you guys after lunch.